All right, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started on today's Real Talk presentation on financial services. Today's topic is going to be around leveraging and automated alternative data sources. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. You are absolutely encouraged and welcome to chat with us through the Q&A widget that you see on our On24 console there. We will be taking your questions at the end of today's presentation, so don't be shy. Please do ask any questions that you can think of. We are on a 30-minute timeline, so we will be going pretty quickly, and we'll let you get back to your day. We are recording today's presentation, and also I want to encourage you all to take a look at the resources that you see on the platform right within the On24 widget there. So let's go ahead and get started. Today's agenda. So today's agenda will largely be Q&A oriented, and we'll be discussing achieving speed to value with alternative data sources, driving a competitive edge in hedge funds and financial services with alternative data, buying and selling alternative data sources, and finally considering alternative data and data sharing for generating alpha. So before we get started here, I will make an introduction to our expert here, Matt Glickman. And Matt leads Snowflake's customer and product strategy. And prior to joining Snowflake, for over 20 years, he led the development of business-critical analytics platforms at Goldman Sachs. And as a managing director, he was responsible for the entire data platform of Goldman's $1 trillion asset management business. So welcome, Matt. We're so pleased to have you presenting today.
Super excited to be here. Thank you.
And I am Melanie Marks, the Director of Industry Marketing. And let's go ahead and get started. So I'll get started by reading a quote that you see in front of you here by Deloitte. And alternative data will likely transform active investment management over the next 5 years. Hedge fund management, long-only mutual funds, and even private equity managers will be impacted. Firms that don't update their investment processes to incorporate alternative data could face the strategic risk of being outmaneuvered by competitors that effectively incorporate big data investment into their securities valuation and trading signal process. So I think that hits upon a lot of what we'll be discussing today, which is get started now, and find out what alternative data can do for you and your organization. So Matt, let's get started with some basic definitions. How do you define alternative data sources? And lots of people have kind of joked around about anything that wasn't available prior to 1995. Do you think that's true?
So thank you, Melanie. And I do like this simpler definition. I mean, the Deloitte setup is actually quite exact, but really, there's so much data that we have access to now, just by the mere fact that we're all carrying around a device that is permanently connected to the internet all the time is a source for so many of these data sources we're going to talk about today. And I think the other thing to sort of go through this, and you'll see highlighted as we go through, is what we call alternative data sets today may already be table stakes for a lot of the people on this call, and it's definitely going to be table stakes going forward. So it's all about how do you get access to more data. Data is power. We all want to be data-driven, but it's all about how the bar is being lowered to get access to a lot of this data. So maybe we can move forward. Sorry, I clicked too many times. So just a quick level setting about traditional versus alternative. I mean, at the end of the day, data is data. But as a level setting, what I would call traditional data is data that has been used by the definition that Melanie said, before 1995, but that goes for traditional financial data from quarterly reports, filings, financial filings, the traditional vendors like Reuters, Bloomberg, and others. But then it opens up all these other opportunities of these data sets that are now available, maybe not conveniently available, and that's what we're going to hit on today, but it's available and it's being used in different shapes or forms. But some examples, and we'll talk about more, but online media and getting sentiment out of that, social media, which from its the publicly accessible Twitter and other kinds of social media feeds, retail data and a lot of e-commerce and e-retail data, and getting people's buying habits from that. IoT, which is a huge source of alternative data that people hadn't thought about. Geospatial data and how much GPS tracking is on things. And then, we didn't include it here, but the other thing I would highlight is, alternative data is new forms of alternative data sets are, we come up with all the time. And one of my favorite examples was around the hotel industry, where people wanted to track how hotel occupancy was going. They wanted to see a way to find out how a hotel was doing before their quarterly reports. And they literally started paying college kids to stay outside hotel in hotel parking lots at night to take pictures of how many lights were on at night, and basically just getting that scanned in and using that data to get a pretty good indication of how much, what kind of occupancy these hotels were getting. So what I'll leave you with that is that the possibilities are endless, and the key is how do you get access to this data in a timely fashion that you can use in your decision making. So with that as the backdrop of the types of alternative data sets and the never-ending set of them, the interesting question, and we'll talk a little bit about that, is effectively, as data becomes more accessible and as the data becomes more vast, how this data is acquired, how the consumers of this data want to buy it and want to be sold to is an interesting space. Right? The idea of paying for a license for data that was a traditional data feed may not make as much sense when you're talking about getting access to these alternative data sources. So we'll talk about it in a bit, but I think that's something also that is due for disruption. But basically, the goal here, and there's many different reasons why you want to get more data, why you want to look for alternative data sources. But the one that I saw the most, and I think is the most interesting disruption that is already happening, is the notion of achieving alpha, right? The ability to see signal in the market that is not, obvious to everyone. That's not just, that is additional edge and additional information that you can basically predict with better accuracy than others in the market and your competitors. So part of it is finding and acquiring these data sets. Part of it is getting these data sets in an accurate and timely way. But then part of it is also using this data in a way that's actually gonna be useful and timely. Let me just keep going. So I like this slide that Deloitte put together. And it's basically what this slide is trying to show is kind of the evolution of where different groups of people are in starting to use alternative data sources, whether or not they're the early adopters, which are more of the aggressive kind of quant hedge funds, then long only, then more the tech savvy, corporate investment management, funds, and then sort of the bell curve goes from there. Where now, if you're not keeping up with that front of the pack, you're going to start to fall behind. So where we are on this bell curve, it probably depends on where you're sitting. But I would point out to you is that this call is not about talking about how to get further up the curve. What I think is going to happen, as you'll see, is that what we're going to be talking about today is likely to accelerate where this will no longer be an early adopter problem, and there'll be a lot more opportunities to get easier access to this data by what the cloud and what we're talking about today at Snowflake can enable. So one of the problems that I think kind of falls in here is that assuming you can find these data sets, right, whether or not it be, from some vendor you find out there, some enterprise who just happens to have a data set that is valuable to get signal out of and figured out how to package it up in a secure way. It still comes back to how do you get access to this data, and what does it take for the provider of this data, right? Whether or not it be, any of the kind of providers we talked about, some IoT company that has data that, they want to sell, it still has to go through this complex deconstruction and reconstruction process. For those of you more technical on the call, it sort of falls into the standard ETL process, but for these alternative data sets, it's magnified. These data sets tend to be larger and tend to be more dynamic. So the idea of having to go through, the data provider providing it in some place that they stage it to their consumers has to be transferred with some from traditional mechanisms, whether it be, putting it on an S3 bucket, or God forbid, putting in an FTP site, or worse, an API that can't scale. Right? This problem persists and is magnified in this day and age of these larger and dynamic data sets. Yes, Melanie, you want to take it from there?
Sure. So thanks for that. So tell us a little bit about how Snowflake relates to actually customers wanting to take advantage of alternative data, and how it can help the banking industry.
I'm glad you asked it. So just again, a little bit of a standard background on what Snowflake is. I imagine most of you know since you've signed up for this, but Snowflake is a brand new, or was brand new, but it's a widely used now cloud data warehouse built from the ground up to handle scale like no other data platform on the planet. It allows customers to basically not think about infrastructure, basically to have unlimited storage because the cost is basically this cloud storage. And then you can focus on your data. You can focus on the analytics, focus on, look at all the data, not have to carve out what's high value or not. Just look at all the data you have for different purposes. And then you can basically use the cloud economics to scale on demand to all of your users. So this is kind of the standard place that we start with. Without all this, we wouldn't be talking about what I believe is a major disruption that we're having, but it needed this kind of core platform that could scale in a particularly interesting way because of this scale is delivered in a multi-tenant, multi-cloud, cross-region global platform that is leveraging the Amazon and other cloud vendors that we work with to be able to deliver this at scale. So one nice feature that fell out of how Snowflake was developed that's relevant to getting access to these alternative data sets is what we call our data sharing feature. So this basically allows two or more companies who are using Snowflake as their data warehouse platform to basically get access to each other's data in a secure and controlled fashion, but without having to copy data. So, if there's a data provider that has their IoT data and wants to provide it to a hedge fund, they basically just open up a channel and say, Mr. Hedge Fund, here is access to the data. No copies, no nothing, just live access to this, in this case, IoT data that's being provided. And this is transformational on lots of other purposes, but particularly to get access to these alternative data sets. You can now have much more timely, much more precise access to data at scale. So this is this kind of enabling capability, and it basically is available to all Snowflake customers at no cost. So Snowflake does not stand in the middle of these transactions. We provide the fabric, we provide this connectivity, and we enable both sides to have this more direct connectivity. And this, what happens today to get access to these alternative data sets can now be vastly accelerated because data doesn't have to be copied. It's provided in a secure and very resilient fashion. And most interestingly, then this data can now be combined, again, without copying, between multiple providers, but even more interestingly, with data, for example, that the hedge fund has themselves, so they can now join these data sets together and decide for exploration, and then put this into production, all without even having to move data or even having to have a data pipeline. So to give you a sense for the kinds of data that are already on platforms, Snowflake has a couple of thousand customers already. Some examples of the kind of data that is already on platform. And again, I mention this as, to kind of seed the thought process, right? Snowflake, like we said, is not standing in between, right? We're providing this as a service. We're happy to introduce, but it's really amongst customers to work out the financials between them. But just to give some examples, shared bicycle location data, that's sort of the geospatial data we mentioned. Some of the exercise services that are basically, social media for exercise and that kind of geospatial data. Retail and point of service, what people are buying, hotel bookings, grocery and the point of service there, airline bookings, retail inventory, mortgage data, even security threat detection is actually a very interesting space of getting access to data and what that implies. So this is by no means the definitive set, the end set, but the interesting part here is as more and more customers are coming online, it presents very interesting opportunities for these customers and for the financial customers who are looking for opportunity to get better signal. A lot of the data may already be available.
Okay, great. So I do want to take some time for some questions at the end. So what we'll do now is how do you take our audience through kind of some recommendations around some of these enterprises that are looking to actually get started, and then we'll take you through some closing remarks. And then while we're doing that, I again want to encourage the audience to submit any questions that you might have from the presentation that we've just gone through. So Matt, let's go ahead and take our audience through getting started. What's the best place to start here?
Sure, and one of the things, and I'll go through. So we want to cut through the hype, and I think that's always a good thing to do. One of the things that I think we alluded to, but we didn't go through, is that what's really driving a lot of this excitement to get access to more direct access to alternative data sources is not just for getting people to have access to more and better data, but to have models and more advanced machine learning models to have access to more data. One of the things that I think that is, if you're not already in that space, I think that the other accelerant that is, in addition to the fact that we're all carrying these devices, is the fact that particularly these deep learning and more advanced models, the more data they can get from more sources, the better they can get in their signals. So I would encourage you, in addition to cutting through the hype, to look at some of the material that we've posted about machine learning and how that is a kind of a driver in this convergence between machine learning and data warehousing. The second is something that we're happy to encourage, is to reach out to us and Snowflake's customers already about data sources that they may have that you would find interesting to have access to. Again, that's for, we can do the introductions. We're not trying to be the middleman in these things. But I would encourage you to reach out to these customers and see how they can provide either, the data they already have, data they may have, masked versions, anonymized versions of those same data sets. All of that, again, is something that I would encourage you to do and not wait. Because, what we alluded to earlier in the Deloitte chart we had, this is already commonplace. What we call alternatives is mainstream for a lot of market players already. The more you can get ahead of this and get more direct access, the better. Then lastly, I would say think big, right? Think about what you could do if you had access to data in a more timely fashion, right? What the cloud has enabled and what Snowflake is enabling is really transformative, and it's only limited by people's imaginations and by ideas that they have of what they could do with this access to alternative data. So, in closing, and then we'll open up for questions. As we mentioned, alternative data is, what's alternative data today is will be commonplace. Will be even traditional tomorrow. Talked about not waiting. I really had this quote with one of our customers that I'll read, and really what was the trigger for this webcast. And his words were, "I will voraciously take any meeting with any Snowflake customer who can deliver instant access to alternative data sources with Snowflake data sharing." Right? This was a real quote, came from head of data acquisition in a top-tier hedge fund. He got it. I'm hoping many of you on this phone call got it. This should be a major disruption in how data is accessed. And it should just become, a better way for now, an additional way, but hopefully a better way to get these data sets into your enterprise so that you can use them to get better signal about what you're looking at in the market.
All right, so what I wanted to do now, Matt, is just let the folks know that there is a way to get up and started for free. We actually do have a self-service model where you can log into Snowflake, and we offer 400 credits for those that want to take a test drive, as they say. And please check out the resources that you see, again, within your On24 widget there. The last thing I'll mention before we ask you some questions, Matt, is that we are taking this topic on the road. We are opening a brand new office in Bryant Park in New York. If you're in that area, we'd love for you to join us on October 10th. Matt will be leading this conversation along with our customer, Mitsubishi Financial Group, so we'd be thrilled to have you on site in Bryant Park. There is a link for you to register if you'd like to do so. Would love to see you there. And let's go ahead and get to some questions, Matt. So the first question that I see here is around streaming alternatives into Snowflake itself. What do we support for ingestion?
That's a great question. So that really does line into a lot of alternative data sources are now constantly streaming. So we have a service we announced last fall. It's called Snowpipe, and it's basically our serverless way to get streaming data into Snowflake. Today, you can basically point Snowpipe at a S3 or an S3 bucket, so that as data arrives, either Kafka, Kinesis, or whatever, it gets streamed continuously into Snowflake. Later this year, we'll even have even more direct connectivity for these streaming sources. But yes, I think many of our customers, even before we announced Snowpipe, were already doing continuous loading of data into Snowflake. And now with Snowpipe, it's something that you can basically become even more economical, and it works as a completely serverless offering. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, great. There's another question here, Matt. You mentioned machine learning. What is the best way to train my ML model using data in Snowflake?
Great question. So Snowflake has pretty strong connectivity. We have a native Python connector. So if you're writing Python code to train your models, basically you can just connect to Snowflake and access data. One of the more interesting integrations that we've worked on actually for the past few years is how we've integrated deeply with Apache Spark. Many of you may have seen we had a partnership announcement with Databricks, I think last month, and which is furthering that integration with our partners in the space. So I would encourage you to look into how we've integrated with Apache Spark. It's a very deep integration. Basically can do a massive amount of performance gain for having that data integrate with your machine learning training. Think of Snowflake as a real enabler in feature engineering and just a very easy way to get data into your models at scale.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for another question or two. One of our attendees is asking about naming some of the actual players that we mentioned for alternative data that are selling or sharing their alternative data. And as you see, there's Matt's email address. We don't want to actually mention some of those players, but Matt, I expect that you'd be able to have a private conversation if you're willing to do so.
Yeah, no, I would encourage you to reach out, directly. Again, we take our customers' privacy extremely seriously. I think we gave enough hints to some of the ideas we have, but it's not our place to be naming our customers or to basically be the go-between, but happy to make the introductions. It's an interesting idea, of ways that we could provide a catalog in the future. Either with our new Partner Connect that was recently announced or some other fashion like that. So I think that's another interesting venue. But I think regardless, if you're interested, please reach out and we can connect you to the right folks to talk more about, who are the actual customers who are already on platform, who are already doing this or who would be interested in doing this with you. Okay,
great. One other question. How does Snowflake mask data?
Great question. So masking is something that is something that we can do quite interestingly. So when we talked about this notion of instant data sharing, that can either be done by exposing an entire database, a set of tables, or most interestingly, and this is how most of our customers are using it, with a secure view. So instead of providing direct access to the physical underlying table, giving access to a view that can be evaluated at runtime. So in this view, what we're finding is customers are doing masking right there, so that they can they don't have to keep a copy of the masked and unmasked data. They basically have their data in their raw form, and then they serve up a masked version of that data that's either masked at the same elemental level or aggregated, or whatever shape or form. But these views, since they're evaluated at runtime, you don't have to keep any other data set in sync. So I think that's hopefully answers your question. There's lots of other things about how to mask data before the data is loaded, which we can talk about, as a follow-up. But I think this dynamic serving and masking, on demand is a pretty interesting way that we've seen masking get used.
Okay, perfect. And we'll take one final question, and then we will wrap up. If we didn't get to all your questions, don't worry, we will be reaching out to you individually. And one final question, Matt. Why not just use S3 or Azure Blob Storage to access alternative data?
Great question. So, and this is it actually ties into what we were just talking about with these secure views. One of the interesting things, it actually falls into two camps. One is control and management of this data, right? By putting the data out into S3, which pretty much is equivalent to putting it out on an FTP site, you have no active control on who's accessing the data, how they're accessing the data. Sure, there's Amazon logs and Azure logs, and they can sort of look at and try to disentangle it. But by the fact that it's literally being hosted in a database that has full query access, you can actually see how your data is being used and build a usage-based monetization model on top of that. And the second, which was, again, tying back, we talked about these secure views, by being able to dynamically serve this data in different shapes or forms based on who is being consumed by, this gives you the benefit of not only seeing how it's being accessed, but controlling how it's consumed, all dynamically. And then most importantly, you get an enormous performance gain, right? All this, the Snowflake, which is beyond the scope of this conversation, but Snowflake is able to deliver orders of magnitude more performance than just scanning data by the fact that all the data has been effectively, like metadata has been extracted ahead of time. So we know exactly the set of data that needs to be loaded to execute a particular query. One of the jokes we talk about in this space is that, like, how do you scan petabytes of storage in sub-second? The answer is you don't. You only access the data you need to, which is typically how most access patterns, are fed. So I think it's a good question. I'm glad you brought it up. It's performance, it's access control, and it's how you can dynamically serve it for different purposes.
All right, Matt, I think that's all the time that we have, and thank you so much for your expertise and your time. I think we've given a lot of great things for our audience to take back and think through, and you're absolutely welcome to reach out to us. You do have Matt's email address. Please reach out with any questions. And we do hope to see you in New York on October 10th. And thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.